I'm Keith Whitelock and welcome to Watercolor Workshop. Almost everybody likes a lighthouse, and I found one that makes an interesting subject. It's on a man-made island up near Havre de Grace, and it's called Fishing Battery Light. It's unusual because it looks just like a little house, and it's surrounded by a bunch of trees now on a low island. Here's a pencil sketch of the lighthouse, and you can see it's just a small little house-like structure surrounded with trees. Now originally there were quite a few other buildings around this lighthouse. There were all kinds of warehouses and factories and things like that. The lighthouse is actually the only structure left now, but it makes a pretty cool subject. And we have a choice working with trees like this. We can go with winter trees where you can see the sky through them, just a bunch of sticks, or we can put in the foliage. I think I'm going to put in the foliage today using a sponge technique. It's a little different than the brush, but it's kind of quick and handy. We don't want to overdo it because it can get gimmicky. But I think we're going to go with a few reflections. That'll add drama. The water will be simple, and we'll just flow in a little indication of some clouds here because we don't want to make the whole thing way too busy. Now I've transferred this sketch to some watercolor paper, and I have just the very barest outlines. And as I so often do, I'm going to wet the sky area with just clear water. We kind of want to get that good wet into wet, fuzzy cloud effect. I'm going to take some light cadmium yellow with this flat brush, and we're just going to put a little warmth down near the horizon. This will actually dry out a lot lighter than it looks. And I'm just going to streak a little bit of it, lift it up into this right corner, and then I'll switch to a similar brush, and we're just going to lay in a little bit of that blue sky color, sweeping it through like this. And we'll get some more going right up here and finish out the top. And I think that's about all I'm going to want for my sky color. While I have this blue on the palette, nice and wet, I'm going to use some of that to just lay in my water area. I'm going to just block it in, except leave out a little space for a light reflection on the building, which I'll just kind of cut across now. And that's just about all we're going to need at this stage of the game, and we'll let the paper dry. All right, now we have the paper dry, and we'll begin with a little brush. It's about a 1/2 inch brush, a flat, and a good flat brush like this can do a lot of different things for you. Take the sketch away. As you see, we want this side of the building nice and dark, and we'll also start using that same brush to sort of fill in some of these little leafy areas here. It's also good for the reflections. Now, the palette's always got a bunch of good little leftover colors in it. I'll take some of the actual blue that I used for the water, and we'll just mix it into some of this brown, a little bit of this greenish color that's here. That'll make a great shadow color for the side of the building. We'll put just a speck of that under the roof, and we'll just bring it down and block in that side of the building. We'll stop right about there. We'll take some of that same leftover color and immediately drop some of it right into this foreground water area. Some of that same color can be used to darken this little space right between the land and the water. We know there's going to be a lot of reflections in here later, and we can just zigzag some of those in right now. It's always good to try and cover up these nice big empty areas with just a few details. Helps break the monotony, and we do want to get rid of that flat, monotonous white paper as soon as we can also. Helps build some initial interest. And since we're working sort of from the background to the foreground, I'm going to turn the paper upside down and just barely indicate with a little more of an ultramarine blue some distant shorelines. It won't look like much at this point, but a little bit later, once we get the rest of the painting developed, they'll pop right into place. This is a good time to put in a roof line on the building. We'll just make that a dark green. And I'll use a nice little pointed round brush for that. And since this paint is so dark, I can also use some of that same color. And we'll just indicate some of the windows that are in the building. I'll take some of that dark color and I'll start to draw out with this little brush some of the dark weeds that we're going to find here and there on this island. I'm going to add just a little bit of a yellow ochre over the building. That'll make it pop out from the background just a little. I'm going to take a little burnt umber, mix that with a little bit of dark blue. Actually, that's a phthalo blue. It's almost a black color, and I'm going to use that to fill in this little part of the lighthouse light itself, the little cupola. We'll just put a couple little frames for the light itself. And also, while I have this almost black color, I'll get back in and put just a few more details in the building and near the base of the weeds. That'll help make those weeds pop. Perhaps just a little more dark blue, just a hint here and there, a couple of lines. And the lighthouse structure itself is basically finished. Now, since one of the primary rules of watercolor is to work from light to dark, I'm actually going to use my grass comb brush at this point to jump in here with the island itself and just start roughing in masses of weeds and leaves. And just let those bristles define all the little separate branches and pieces of the grass. This is a little bit of a dry brush technique. If the brush happened to be just absolutely soaked with pigment, we wouldn't be able to get the little individual branches to jump out. Now that time I added just a little more yellow ochre into the mix and brushed that in. And the same flat brush that I used earlier can now be used to, again, emphasize the reflections and this break between the water and the land. Now, while that dries, I'll get out the sponges and load those up, and we'll show you what the sponge will do. Here I have a couple of natural sponges. I suppose you can use synthetic sponges just as well, but I like natural sponges. They've got a big variety of little spaces and little patterns in the roughness. And they work great for sponging leaves and other textures into a watercolor surface. Sometimes I cut them up. Now these are completely dry. First I'll wet the brush and wring out all the excess water, and we'll load it up with some paint. The first thing I want to do is take a little phthalo blue, add that into my palette mixture. And then I'm going to add a little yellow ochre into that. And if that's not quite bright enough, I can always add some cadmium yellow. And that starts getting into the good summertime bright leaves color. You have to watch out for that. I don't really want it to get what I call crayon green. Green can be kind of treacherous. But we'll mix up some of this, sort of two different tones. I'll just use my grass comb brush for that, and I'll put the brush away. And then I'll take this little natural sponge, and I'm just going to dip the end of that, like so, into this paint, and literally soak it all up. Now on the painting surface itself, where I want the trees, I'm just going to take this like a little rubber stamp and pounce it up and down. I'm going to go light first so that I can sort of preview what I intend to do with this. I'll get a little of that darker mixture. And just use the little end of that sponge to stamp these little leaf-like areas into the trees. Now after just a little bit of that, I'm going to let it dry, and then we'll come back into it and give it sort of a second darker coat. And I'll also want to do some direct brush work in here. While I'm waiting for the leaves to dry, I'll take just a little bit of this burnt sienna and a little burnt umber. And I'll get that mixed up with a little tiny bit of leftover blue. That'll give me a nice little dark color with this really pointy brush. This will allow me to paint in just a few indicators of some of the trees and branches. Now we won't have to draw the entire tree like we would for a winter-like scene, but just a few odd branches here and there. Will really help tell the story. And again, with the dark colors, we'll stipple a little right along the base of this shoreline to make it pop out. It's also good to hand paint a few weeds in. Before I sponge any more leaves into the trees, I'm going to take this opportunity to mix up more burnt umber, more phthalo blue, and in a little separate area I'm going to take some of that phthalo blue and a little bit of the cadmium yellow, make a brighter green. Get just a little bit more of this color saved up for the next passage. Now already the little painting is starting to shape up and look about like what I would be happy with. I'm going to take a little more of this light blue and streak it back into the water area. I think that'll just help make this thing pop. We don't want the water to look too monotonous. And if we paint over anything that we did before, that's just fine too. I'm actually going to take the grass comb brush and go back into the foliage. This is the same place that we used the stamping with the sponge. I'm using a real light kind of bouncy touch with the brush, just letting the bristles bounce along on the surface. And that works almost as good as the sponge itself. But if we mix these two textures together, I think it makes just a real nice effective group of trees. They don't look quite gimmicky like that. I will load up the little sponge again and take it back into the trees and really punch up some of the shadows with it. Since we've got all kinds of little bushes, shrubs, weeds, all sorts of mysterious little growth here on the island, we'll go ahead and hit that with the sponge with the dark paint too. The little painting's coming along good now. it's a nice time to squint at it, because if you squint at it, you really increase the contrast and you'll be able to pick up on areas that look weak and need just a little bit more work. Now, as I squint at it, I notice that the reflections from the building are a little weaker than what I would like, so I will just make those a little heavier. There should be a little more of a reflection from this tree. We'll put that in. And since this foliage over on the far right is dark, that would also tend to reflect down here in the little ripples and waves. And the bulk of our reflections are going to come from this very dark mass of trees on the left side of the island. And we don't want every little wave to be the same size. We want some larger dark waves, and we'll mix that up with a bunch of little wavelets, little tiny wave tops that are catching the light, catching the shadows from the trees. And the more we mix those up, the more effective the whole painting becomes. And it's looking pretty good. Now, so far the darkest darks that we have in the painting are right up here in the cupola of the lighthouse. And we still want some of those darks down in some of the weeds and maybe in the base of the trees. With some burnt umber on my brush, I'm just going to sort of dry brush and flip some darkness up near the water's edge. This dry brush is great for putting in little indications of weeds. I've got the sponge out one more time, and this time I'm really going to darken up just a few key areas of the trees. I think that gives us just about what we want. Now, just to finish the painting out, I'm going to take a little tiny bit of burnt sienna, drag that into the shadow side of the building, and as the brush goes dry, a little on the front side, just to darken it. And I'm going to take just the slightest hint of that same color and throw it into the reflections. And to add just a little interest and variety in the water to help sort of knit this whole business together, I'm going to put just a few touches of it in the water. And that has just about the effect I want. Now, the last thing I want to do is take a very small round brush and load it up with some dark colors and just go in and detail a few of the grasses. Just pick out a couple of very separate leaves, and I think we'll call this one finished. There, that's just about got it. I don't want to overwork it, but I might pick at it just a little more just to add in some detail or anything that I overlooked. Hope you enjoyed the use of the sponge today. That was a little different. Please join me again here on Watercolor Workshop on Pack 14. I'm Keith Whitelock.